Today, November 17th, is Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. It's a day to draw attention to the family, friends, and co-workers impacted when someone chooses to end their life. According to the Survivors of Suicide Loss Task Force in 2015 report, roughly 20 people are directly and intimately affected by a suicide. So let's take a look at Nova Scotia. In 2016, there were 134 suicides in the province. So that means an estimated 2,680 people were seriously affected by those deaths. Earlier today, I spoke with Simon Sherry, a clinical psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University. He says we need to be doing more to support those struggling with thoughts of suicide and for those left behind. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
It's an important thing to talk about, but I know when I started out in the media, we wouldn't even say the word suicide. We wouldn't cover it. It was just silence, and it didn't seem to help. Why do we need to talk about it and get the message out there?
It's critically important that we talk about suicide in a responsible way. It will help those in need reach out. It will also help to destigmatize the problem of suicide. There's absolutely nothing wrong with talking about suicide as long as that's done in a reasonably responsible manner.
Can you talk about this day, Survivors of Suicide Loss? Why have a day? How big of an issue is this?
This is an issue of great importance to Nova Scotians. For example, in 2016, we had 134 Nova Scotians die by suicide. If you were to look at conservative estimates, we would say that 20 people are directly and intimately affected in a lasting way by a suicide. So if you combine those two numbers, that's more than 2,600 Nova Scotians in 2016 alone who will be seriously and negatively impacted by suicide.
What is the impact on people that are left behind? How does it manifest?
The aftermath of suicide is very serious. In survivors of suicide loss, you may see guilt and shame. There can be a very strong feeling of rejection or abandonment. Oftentimes a person may feel a sense of responsibility in that loss. It's also important to realize this is not a typical way of dying. Death by suicide can often be shocking and involve dying in an undignified way.
What I've heard is the biggest struggle afterwards is asking why. Are we any closer to knowing why? And you told me that we can prevent this.
The question of why is one we're far from having a definitive answer for, but at this point we know that mental illness is intimately involved in suicide. More than 90% of people who die by suicide have some sort of diagnosable mental illness, and in particular it looks like depression is involved, with more than 60% of people who die by suicide having some sort of diagnosable depression.
Can you share who are these victims? I mean, we're talking about numbers here, but the makeup of the person. Male, female, young, old?
Suicide cuts across all demographics in our culture. It's also the case, though, that certain groups are more vulnerable, and I think that's very important for us to understand and have a plan that takes into account that our military personnel, our first responders, people with mental illness, and other groups are especially vulnerable to suicide.
The other reason I read, the reason for having this day, Survivors of Suicide Loss, is because once there's been that loss, it can lead to another loss. Can you explain that?
That's absolutely correct, and that's a very important part of our conversation here today. Suicide can lead to suicide. In other words, in the wake of losing someone by suicide, oftentimes friends, family members, or other loved ones are very vulnerable to suicide themselves. If you look at available research, it looks like people are anywhere from 2 to 40 times more likely to attempt suicide or to die by suicide if they've lost someone through suicide. And we see this play out in our province. We've seen it very recently in Escazone. It also happened in that same region in 2009. We've also seen it in the Cape Breton Victoria School Regional Board, where another cluster of young people took their lives. So it's very important to help actively survivors of suicide loss, in part to prevent future suicides.
How do we really help? And I guess it starts from the beginning of how can we prevent someone from even thinking that that's their only option left?
On the prevention side of things, it's important that we limit access to common means of dying by suicide. A success story locally would be the bridge barriers that we put up on the McDonald Bridge. Beyond that, we need to connect people to evidence-based therapies and medications that have been shown to reduce suicide. When we look on the side of survivors of suicide loss, we need a concrete, actionable plan that gets put in place when a suicide occurs. This could include better coordination among police, first responders, school personnel, health professionals, faith leaders to help people in the wake of a suicide. We should also look at assigning support workers to help people deal with the psychological and the practical aftermath of a suicide. And we're going to want to pay particular attention to training specialists within our healthcare system to help people following a suicide loss.
Now we're just coming up to the holidays. I'm just wondering, are there different times of year where we see this happen more often, that we could have some prevention with that too, to be prepared?
Time of year can be a factor. You'll often hear Christmas as a time discussed around a period where people have mental health difficulties, but what data shows in North America is that the peak period for vulnerability for suicide isn't around the Christmas time, it's in the New Year. So the first 2 to 3 weeks in the New Year tends to be a time when suicide peaks, in part because New Year's is a temporal landmark and people 3 weeks or so in, if they haven't observed a change, may feel like they're out of hope.
So if somebody is watching this and they feel like they're out of hope, what hope can you give them? What message would you give them?
I would strongly tell them that suicide is very preventable and that the mental health problem that's quite likely accompanying their suicide is treatable. We have interventions that work, and I would encourage them to reach out to a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a family doctor, or another helping professional and get help because it's there for them.
And we need it more than ever on the East Coast, because you gave me an alarming stat before we started our conversation. Can you share that about how we compare with the rest of the country?
Between 2000 and 2012, our suicide rate has gone up higher and faster in Nova Scotia than any other province in Canada. To offer you an example of that, in 2000 we had 75 people die by suicide. By 2016, that number had gone up to 134 people. That's more than a 40% increase. Without exaggeration, we can say that there's a crisis in our province when it comes to suicide. Fortunately, there are ways in which we can prevent suicide, but that's going to require our government to take a hold of this problem and to have a real actionable plan with earmarked funds for a definite purpose to reduce suicide. We've seen similar success stories in Quebec, England, Scotland, Michigan, and other places in the world. There's no reason we can't do that in Nova Scotia.
What did they do that's different, that can make a difference?
For example, right now Nova Scotia is running what I'd call a catch and release approach to suicide. Somebody presents to their family physician or to the emergency room and they get minimal help and then they're released into the community. In contrast, in those healthcare systems that treat people who are suicidal is very important patients. They're identified by the system, they're closely tracked by the system, they don't fall through the cracks, and as they move from one system of care to another, they're very closely followed. And that can be a very important means of suicide prevention.
A final thought to end on?
It's time for our province to take action and to implement an evidence-based, well-funded suicide prevention strategy. We can prevent suicide in this province when our government wants that to happen.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you for drawing attention to a very important topic.
We're going to be back with much more on CTV News at 6 right after this.